would like to now introduce our panelists.
On the far left is, my left, is Andrew Rehfeld, the new President CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. He was, until September, a professor of political science at Washington University. Larry Levin, publisher, CEO of The Jewish Light, and J. Martin Rochester, curators teaching professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Andrew, to begin the discussion, what is the Jewish vote? How would you define it?
Thanks, Batya. I want to start by just thanking you for the invitation and thanking all of you for showing up this evening. I also want to say, because I can never say that here in St. Louis, that finally, when I have somebody sitting next to me who I can say, where did you go to high school? And we both went to the same high school back in Baltimore City. So it's really a thrill to be here. The question's a terrific one, and it's a great way to begin the evening. What is the Jewish vote? And at a general level, what I want to say to begin with is that I think it's a fiction that we create for ourselves, and it will depend precisely on how we define it. And I think that there really are three different ways that we can define it. We can define it by the kind of communities, the goods of the communities that are at stake. We can define it by the kind of values that Jews tend to support, and we can define it by the kind of behaviors that Jews engage in. And each one of those is going to produce a slightly different answer. So in the first case, we asked what kind of communities, what is the good of the community? Well, there are going to be different kinds of Jewish votes because the different candidates and different policies are going to support the Orthodox, the Reform, the Conservative, the general Jewish community. They're going to support and detract from in different ways from concerns about Israel and the way that Israel is portrayed. So that's the first question to ask. What is the community you have in mind, and how does the candidate or the policy promote or detract from the good of that community? The second one has to do with the values that we as Jews hold. And even that formulation, we as Jews, I think is very dangerous because, again, different communities, and within the communities, there's some communities too, have different variants on what they think is important. So typical Jewish values include social justice, issues of the needy, anti-Semitism and combating it, and the kind of policy areas that we support as an outgrowth of the particular faith communities of the particular communities in which we are as Jews. And finally, if we ask the question, what is it that Jews do, we get again another mixed answer. As we all know, Jews historically have been Democrats and voting Democratic. But again, if you divide it a little bit different and you ask, is that Jews by identification or Jews by profession and commitment? The more committed, the slightly more conservative you will get in terms of the Republican-Democratic split, often mapping onto support for Israel. So what that means is that people who are engaged in the Jewish community tend to be a little more higher in support of Israel in a traditional way, and rightly or wrongly, the perception is that the right wing within America, at any rate, is the place that they're more likely to support. Both groups are overwhelmingly Democratic, but again, it's not consistent. So again, bottom line is, I think it's very hard to say what the Jewish vote is, but there really are these three ways that we can think about it. What community's good is being served, what values are being promoted, and ultimately, what is it that Jews do?
Yeah, thank you. And thank everyone for being here, Batya, to you as well. I promise I won't read a lot from my notes, although I gotta say, with two professional political scientists up here, I'm at a severe disadvantage. But I did find this article by the Jewish journalist Shmuel Rosner today that had a comment about the Jewish vote, and he was addressing the circumstances where, what happens if the Jewish vote doesn't matter in terms of the ultimate outcome of an election. And he said this, which I thought was great. You immerse yourself in a minuscule detail of little value to most other people and debate ad nauseum consequences of infinitesimal variations that got me thinking that studying the Jewish vote is much like studying the Talmud and a very Jewish thing to do, which I thought was right on. So.
I would add just, we're talking about roughly 6 million people when we talk about the Jewish vote. They don't all vote the same, obviously. There's some obvious differences among Orthodox Jews, for example, and relative to Reform Jews. But they constitute about only 2% of the population, 2% of the registered voters, but they do vote as a bloc in the sense that they consistently voted Democratic. 65% of Jews identify with the Democratic Party. And by the way, a very good website on this is the Pew Religion and Politics website that gives a lot of statistics. I'll stop it at that, and we can get into some of the other issues.
Thank you. Marty, in the American Jewish Committee's 2012 survey of American Jewish opinion, there was perhaps a surprising result. Only 22% of Jewish voters placed Israel as one of the top 3 issues in deciding which candidate to vote for. Only 15% said Iran. Overwhelmingly, the top issues were the economy at 80%, healthcare at 57%, followed by taxes and national security. What do you think of this ordering? What are the implications?
Well, I'm surprised by that finding. I would have imagined Israel would be much more important on the agenda of Jews. So to say 22% kind of surprises me. I think, to me, I would suggest 4 issues that seem to be most important in my mind. Israel being one. The second would be the legacy of anti-Semitism and discrimination that then translates into social justice, civil rights related issues. The third issue that's not mentioned there, but I find in my own experience seems that maybe on an anecdotal basis is very important, is the abortion issue. Really is a major issue, I think, for a lot of Jews. And then there's also certainly the related to the abortion issue, I think there's a kind of First Amendment religious right issue that comes up. One of the reasons why I think in the 1990s Jewish voters voted in very extraordinarily large numbers for Clinton, and then into the 2000s as well for Obama, has to do with the rise of the religious rights. I'm surprised that was not mentioned in the statistics.
Anybody else?
Well, the numbers that you quote, 22% for Israel, 15% for Iran, was that their number one issue, or just said it was any issue that was a concern? The top three, yeah. It reflects what I was talking about my guess is that the denominator there is just people that identify as Jews, not people who are engaged in the Jewish community. And my guess is the people that list Israel and Iran are systematically higher in their engagement in the Jewish community. And when we look, the Federation involvement, just as an example, or affiliation with synagogue, 22%, 15%. I'm not sure that's so far off from the numbers that are involved in the Jewish community in some sort of formal way. So I think that's mapping that kind of distinction. Do you identify and participate as a Jew, or are you simply Jewish?
I was on a panel discussion yesterday. The Jewish Daily Forward had a conference call for journalists, and they were talking about foreign policy issues. And it was very interesting because I asked actually a question about this, and put another way on some Jews' rankings of important issues, Israel will go down as low as 6th or 7th or 8th and something like that. And so I asked about that. And one of the reporters from the Forward had a perspective that I really hadn't thought about. And he said it may be at least in part because there's been a perception by some American Jews that they haven't had to worry about safety and security of Israel. And certainly to the extent that, I want to jump on what you said, Andrew, that those who are involved in the community more actively and aggressively, will probably understand and think about the implications and the consequences much more. So I thought that was a very interesting comment that you made.
Thank you. They really filled out filled out what's behind those statistics. And now, Larry, as was mentioned, Jews make up a whopping 2% of the U.S. population. I have even seen the number of 1.7%. In Florida, the most Jewish of the swing states, they comprise 4% of the population. Shmuel Rossner, the same Shmuel Rossner, in the foreword compared the Jewish vote with that of Iowa. Such a tiny fraction, and yet such a sense of importance. What is the impact of the Jewish vote? Can the Jewish vote tip elections?
Yes and no. There are only about 8 or 9 states in which the Jewish population comprises more than 2% of the population of the state. In this particular election, when you put that on top of how many or how few swing states there are, for instance, the number of opportunities for there to be a statistically significant impact is relatively low. So first, with respect to Florida, which has about 638,000 identified Jews in the state, there's the potential for greater impact. But there's also potential for greater information spreading amongst the general population. So whether or not ultimately the difference in whether a small amount of undecideds vote one way or the other, and according to most of the polls, and I think there was an AJC poll in Florida that showed the break at about 65-25, which left about 10% undecided. If you tilt that undecided one way or the other by about 10%, you're talking about 5,000 votes. Could that be significant? Well, 2008, every vote was significant, and we've seen in Florida where even more than that. But I think also the Jewish population has obligation and opportunity to promote the issues, discuss the issues, be a larger voice with respect to issues that are important to Jews. So it's not simply about the percentage of Jews and how many vote. It's about the opportunity to communicate issues that are of significant consequence to the Jewish population.
All the polls, the latest polls, show an increased tightening of the race, with the so-called swing or battleground states becoming increasingly important. And Jews have a very sizable presence in 10 states that account for 270 electoral votes in the electoral college that you need to win the presidency, including obviously not just New York and California, but also Florida and the swing states. Of course, New York and California are not swing states, but swing states like Ohio and Florida and also Virginia, Jews have a strategically critical presence. They do turn out to vote. Unlike other groups, Hispanics, African Americans, young people, that the Democratic Party is counting on for turnout, the Jewish vote will turn out.
I think I want to say 2 things about that. Number one is that when we talk about the Jewish vote, the way that you framed it, Batya, in the question, I think we have to be sensitive to why is it that candidates take Jewish issues so seriously. And that has as much to do with where the money is coming from as it is with where the votes are coming from. I don't know what the distribution of the campaign finance contributions are, but that is a question. As you raised it, I'm realizing, well, wait a second. What fuels the issues in politics is as much where the money's coming from, and that's a path that we have to ask. In terms of the percentages, the question that we should be asking is not what the percentage is of the population. That's 2%, but rather what is the percentage of the expected voting population? My guess is that Jews vote in a higher rate than the rest of the community, which means that we may be 2%, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's double or triple that in terms of the actual voting population. Complete speculation on my part, but that would be the number that we'd want to be looking at.
All right, we'll now move to the general questions. And before we begin, I'll throw out perhaps an answer to a Trivial Pursuit question at some point. The first time that the term Jewish vote was used. Anybody know? It was in 1868, and it was around the election of General Grant. And there was great anger in the Jewish community because of his banning of the Jews from the war zone. And despite the fact that Abraham Lincoln had rescinded that ban, the anger remained, and there were public statements that the Jewish vote, using that term, would reflect. So it goes all the way back there. Okay. Something that many of you may have heard, and it's in a way a politically incorrect statement, but I'll use it because it became part of the popular parlance, and that's American Jews earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. Now, this was touched on earlier when there was some discussion of the Jewish vote being heavily democratic. And it has been heavily, consistently democratic. 1948, 90% to Truman. 2008, 78 plus to now President Obama. And the only dip, and there was a severe dip, was with Carter, for reasons that people might have opinions on. But it has been consistent. And I wonder whether you might dig a little more into the reasons that essentially, I think it was Milton, I forget who it was, but was quite angry at the Jews for, quote, voting against their economic interests. And why is this the case? And do you think that it will continue?
There's a book that some of you may be familiar with by Thomas Frank entitled What's the Matter with Kansas? Where, the thesis is that Kansans should be voting for Democratic based on their economic self-interest, but they tend to vote Republican because of their social issues mainly. So I guess we probably should have a book, What's the Matter with Jews? In that we seem to, our economic interests seemingly would drive us to vote Republicans, but we vote Democratic. The reason we vote Democratic, I think it clearly goes back to 1932, the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the beginning of what's called the New Deal Coalition. 1932 is what political scientists call a realignment election. That is where there were enormous shifts in what's called party identification, where lots of folks, including Jews, shifted their party ID to the Democrats. And party ID is a very powerful determinant of how you vote, and it's hard to shake once you develop that party ID. 65% of Jews today identify with the Democratic Party. And that is a very powerful determinant. It's not inevitable that they're going to vote Democrat. It's a very powerful determinant. Related to that, of course, the Democratic vote came out of the Jewish urban experience, immigrant experience, poverty, working class background, issues that the Democratic Party under FDR certainly seemed to relate more to than the Republicans. Just one other thing, a lot of Jews in Eastern Europe who came over in the early 20th century came out of an anarchist or socialist labor union background, and this also resonated as far as the Democratic Party way. And then again, also, of course, again, the legacy of discrimination and anti-Semitism that translated eventually into support for civil rights and social justice. And just one last point. Bottom line is Jews tend to be liberal, ideologically. And the Democratic Party tends to represent liberalism.
And I think this is one reason, just from a purely political, pragmatic perspective, this is one reason the Israel issue becomes so darn important in the elections. It is because the conservative side of the aisle would like and hope that the demographics would push the Jewish community further to the right. It's been incredibly resistant to that over the decades. Will that change? I don't know. Another thing in looking forward to consider is, will Jews consider their Jewishness the principal basis for their voting determination? This year, good example. We have an overwhelming gender gap in the election. We have a 9% favorite for Romney, the Republican candidate, 9% for males, 9% for females going in the other direction. Our male Jews and female Jews looking at the gender issues when they make those voting determinations, your guess is as good as ours. But looking at Judaism as part of the overall fabric of an individual may be a little bit of a clue to what happens in the future.
Yeah, those are great points. I just want to reinforce what Larry just said about Israel, that, until Carter, the Democratic support of Israel was just clear. Remember, it was Truman who was in office, who was the first one to support Israel, and sort of the clarity of support among Democrats. It was Carter that begins to shift. And now you just saw the debate, anyone that watched it and all the commentary afterwards, it's hard to figure out what the difference is between Romney and Obama in terms of policy. What the Republicans have done a very good job at is to play Obama's reticence to emotionally engage with Israel. Frankly, he's reticent to emotionally engage with just about anything. That's his style of leadership. And they're playing that because Romney does have an emotional salience with Israel, particularly with Bibi Netanyahu, who's a friend. And they're using that emotional salience much more than the policy issues, which don't seem to separate the parties all that much, to drive that gap right now and see if they can open up a wedge on a historical issue that Democrats have been very supportive of in the past.
I'd like to push a little bit more on this question of the identification of the Jewish vote with the Democratic, with the liberal side of the spectrum. You would expect that. You might expect that this would be universal, and that the Jewish vote in, let's say, Britain or France or Australia or South America would be the same, and it's not. Jewish voters in those countries are generally not liberals. Why?
Yeah. My presumption, I don't know, Marty will speak to the facts. I'm a political theorist, before I took this job as a political theorist, so I did the theory before I the fact. My guess is those communities, from what I know of them, have more engaged. There's less of a secular, assimilated population among the Jews as a proportion of them. And as I said before, those who are engaged and more religious in particular tend to be more conservative and tend to support those. My guess is that's what's doing it, number one. Number two is the FDR piece that I guess that Marty mentioned. And number three are the set of rights issues that define America. The right of religious freedoms, the free speech rights, things like that, which tend to have lined up along the left in the United States that Jews care about. So I don't know how they map one in the other countries, but I think it's what we call overdetermined, and multiple reasons why that would be the case.
I don't really have a lot to add other than the interesting question of what is liberalism, or what does it mean to be liberal, which actually, or for that matter, conservative. These labels are getting increasingly confusing, in case you haven't noticed. The best definition, by the way, I heard of liberalism versus conservatism was E.J. Dionne, who said a liberal is someone who wants the government to have its hands in your pocketbook, but not or in your pants pocket, but not your pants. And the conservatives are just the opposite. They want the government in your pants, but not your pants pocket. And I think if you think about it, Jews, which is not a perfect definition, but it's close. Well, EJ Theophany is pretty liberal, wouldn't you say? But I think it's a somewhat fair definition. And I do think Jews generally, at least in this country, do tend to be liberal in the sense that they tend, coming out of the FDR in 1932, again, welfare state, New Deal tradition, tend to be more supportive of government involvement in the economy, regulation, taxes, social justice, safety net, etc. And when it comes to the issue of abortion and social issues, tend to be prefer government not to be quite as involved or as conservatives in that. And how that relates to Europe, frankly, I'm not really sure.
Okay, let me go on to the next point, one that has come up at several points. And I think it's come across that when we say Jewish vote, we're not talking about a monolithic group. But again, let's dig a little deeper in that. If you could explore the regional differences in the Jewish vote, the role of subgroups, the Orthodox were mentioned. What about the Russian Jews? A significant vote in the New York area, for sure. What about the younger generation? So if you could explore that, and also if you might kind of make a prognostication, how will that affect the nature of the Jewish vote? That's all.
Well, one of my sons is a Lubavitch Hasidic Jew. He's very, 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 very Orthodox, and not surprisingly, tends to be conservative, and represents, of course, one, if you want to call that a regional element. And in terms of demographics, we hear that because of intermarriage, the Jewish population may possibly be dwindling. And because of a decline in religion generally in this country, somebody did a study, 1/3 of all people under 30 are not religious, we're told. And so what I'm suggesting is that we're likely to see, to the extent that people are becoming more religious as Jews, the Orthodox population may be increasing relative to the other, to conservative and reform, and that may have some impact down the road. And there are clear philosophical differences, obviously, on social issues, especially. I don't think so much on economic issues among Orthodox, conservative and Reformed Jews. As far as Russian Jews and some of those other regional differences, I don't see that being terribly important. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe somebody else wants to add something.
We talk a lot this time of year in this quadrennial, sorry about that, about the presidential election, but these differences make a huge difference locally. In the case of New York State, because the Orthodox population is somewhat subsumed in a much larger Jewish population, it's harder to have an impact at the larger electoral college level. If you're talking about House districts and city council and local elections, you're going to see a lot of different interests reflected that are reflected in the middle of a presidential election. So I think those are going to be different based on the local composition of the Jewish population. One issue that came up last year that shows where kind of some of these differences in perspective coalesce is with school vouchers. This was very interesting because you had an issue that was both economic and religious simultaneously, and you actually started to see some traditionally more folks who were more interested in a separation of church and state start to break off, splinter a little bit from the more traditionally liberal or progressive viewpoint on that separation. We saw a little bit of it here with some people who were saying that because it was economically important to have support for their kids to go to a religiously based school in the Jewish community, that they were starting to rethink their perspective. So that pocketbook that Marty was talking about really started to have a direct impact on some people's perspective. And I think you'll see those differences in perception around the country based on the composition of the local Jewish community.
Just two more questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. There's disagreement among rabbis and their congregants all across the country over the role of Judaism, and particularly, let me say, the role of the poet in the national political conversation. And I'll bring you two examples. There's a Rabbi Sharon Grouse, who's the spiritual leader of an independent minyan, Ikar, in Los Angeles. And she gave the most important sermon of the year, the Yom Kippur sermon, to defend religion's role in politics. And she said, I quote, "I do believe the Torah is an inherently political document. I believe our tradition leaves us with a vision of what's possible in the world." And then she says, "and that certain party platforms more closely align themselves with that vision than others." And she goes on to say she therefore thinks it's her obligation as a rabbi to address those issues. Another point of view is expressed by Asher Lopatin, who's the rabbi of the modern Orthodox synagogue Anshe Shalom Bnei Israel in Chicago. And he sees his role more as consciousness-raising than partisan campaigning. A rabbi should not ignore what's going on in the world, he said. I want people to contend with issues and think about them, but as moral concerns, not political ones. What do you think of those two approaches?
Rabbi Grouse has done incredible things with ICAR, and I recommend you all to take a look at it as a model of a progressive, religious and spiritual community. I think she's dead wrong and on this issue, and I think that it's, when I was growing up in the Reform movement, and we would go down to Washington to lobby, I used to think it was very strange that God was a Democrat. And I just find it, everything we have talked about until now is how there are other issues that determine where people are going to vote. If you're in the Orthodox community, if you're in the Reform community, different pieces of your faith is going to determine which party you think is the best one. And I don't think you can just say to court that it's Judaism that is dictating one or another, that one party platform is it. And part of this has to do with the subtlety and nuance of politics. Look, it is just wrong, as I know that some people, and I'm taking her as a point of departure, it's just wrong to say that Republicans don't care about the poor. It's a very nice way to criticize them. They have a different approach to poverty and to the problems of poverty. And for many in the Jewish community, and we can talk about the public policy issue, for many in the Jewish community, they think that their approach is not the right one to poverty. Namely, we should have a stronger safety net, etc. And we can talk about that. But the point is that if you care about poverty, that doesn't tell you which party to vote for, right? It's your public policy that's going to have to articulate which is the right way to vote. Now, again, I'm happy to have the, I have a view on which is the right way, but that isn't coming out of an interpretation. Unless we're going to say there's one interpretation of the text, one interpretation of the tradition that's right, there's no way we can possibly say there's one party that is consistent with this one or that.
Just a few thoughts. First of all, on the issue of poverty, as Andrew indicated, actually there's a lot, I know there's a study at Syracuse University and other studies that indicate that religious people tend to be, who are often conservative, of course, indeed Republican, often tend to be more philanthropic in terms of their personal charity than non-religious people, and Democrats who prefer, understandably, contributing through taxes and through a welfare state, and who's to say which side has it right. On the general question of the role of synagogues, temples, and religious bodies in preaching politics, I would say this, that we have a highly polarized society, as you well know. I think one of the most important roles that our institutions, including religious institutions, can play is to depolarize our society. And that means that when we use this word diversity that we love to use so much, the most important kind of diversity, perhaps, that we don't always talk about is respect for diversity of ideas. And trying to tolerate as wide a range of ideas as possible, as long as they're within legitimate parameters and obviously don't represent extreme, absurd positions. I don't know if Andrew will agree with me, but I work in an area of academia where I don't think there's enough intellectual diversity, quite frankly, okay? There's kind of a liberal orthodoxy in the humanities and social sciences. And so I think in our synagogues and temples, I would hope rabbis would encourage tolerance, respect, understanding, engaging people across a range of values and ideas, as long as they're legitimate. As David Hume said, truth emerges from debate among friends. And I think that's the kind of thing that should be going on in our religious institutions.
Just really quickly, when you look at this issue in the context of the Pew study that you cited before, and the apparent decline of youngsters who want to affiliate religiously, and you're talking about aligning one place of spiritual safe haven with basically oppositional behavior, and that's scary. For those of us who believe that it's very important to have places to go in the world to be able to look inward and to look at yourself and others ethically and morally and spiritually. So it scares me. That's not to say that the spiritual leader can't or shouldn't have a perspective on what it means to be spiritual in the world, but if the message that's sent is that spirituality only translates in one particular way, then I think you're telling those young to stand up and start running the other way, and I think that's extremely dangerous.
It's wonderful round of answers concludes this really very thoughtful segment of the program, and please join me in thanking our wonderful